I want to start tonight's program by talking about something as simple as water. So we're joined by Everglades National Park. One of my favorite animals is pictured here on the screen, the American alligator on a nest there in the Everglades. A tremendous creature. It's so cool. I love them because I love dinosaurs. So I think that they harken back to the dinosaurs. But if there is something that the Everglades and that alligator in the Everglades and the Blackstone River Valley, which you see pictured here, the Ashton Mill and the Blackstone River flowing alongside that Ashton Mill have in common, it's the idea of one simple resource: water. About 60% of the adult human body is made up of water. When I first heard that fact, I went, I think my body's made up of 30% water and 30% coffee. My colleague Allison's body may be made up of 30% tea and 30% Diet Coke. But regardless, science tells us that 60% of the human body is made up of water. 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. About 98% of that water that covers the Earth's surface is salt, with only about 2 to 3% being fresh water. And of that 3%, scientists believe that 1.2% of that is actually drinkable. A simple molecule, two hydrogen atoms, one oxygen atom, join together to form this molecule of water. Water forms the very basis of both of our parks and the very basis of life on Earth itself. Water gives life to the Everglades, the only such freshwater ecosystem in the world. And water gave life and gives life to the Blackstone River Valley, and also helped to power the early years of industrialization in the Blackstone River Valley. But who owns water? Who has a right to use it? And for what purpose can people use water? At a place like the Pawtucket Falls, located today in modern Pawtucket, Rhode Island, at the very southern end of the Blackstone River Valley, water rights has been contested for centuries. When Joseph Jenks first arrived, the first English colonizer on the banks of the Blackstone River, that far down in Pawtucket to establish that small village in Pawtucket, when he first arrived in the late 17th century, he was attracted by the power that the water could provide for his iron forging operations. And as a village developed and other early forms of mills were built around the falls, people sought to redirect the river's natural flow to harness that power of water. And by the 1790s, the community would have looked kind of similar to what you see here. This is an image which comes from a little bit later, from the early 19th century, but similar to what you may have seen by the late 18th century in the 1790s. Several mill buildings directly lining along the banks of the falls itself. But in 1793, about 100 yards upstream from where the falls is, a permanent dam was built across the river. In the image that you see on the left side of your screen, you see several mill buildings and other warehouses, one of which, the one with that bell tower on top of it, being Old Slater Mill itself, and a dam running across the river. The Slater Dam, or the Upper Dam, the first permanent dam to be built along the river. And that dam would divert some of the water off of the river through the Great Flume to power Old Slater Mill. That same year in 1793, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a law which indicated that all dams along the river had to be torn down each spring for fish passage, except for one: the Upper Dam, or Slater Dam. For the first time in colonial and the early states' history, legislation that prioritized one company's right to harness the power of the river over the right of farmers further upriver to use the river as a source of food with the fish that traveled up it. This would begin decades of court cases, legal arguments, disagreements, litigation, and laws and regulations to follow. This was a turbulent process. In fact, in 1792, before the dam was even finished, locals came out in the middle of the night and tore down the structure that was the original Slater Dam. As they were building it, literally, locals came out and sabotaged it. They tore it down. They were opposed to the construction of this dam. Another key factor is not just the dam itself, but a waterway which passed the river and passed the falls, known originally as the Little River and later would become known as Sergeant's Trench. And Sergeant's Trench would be the Little River was a natural passage which went around the falls, which in the early 1700s was manipulated by a gentleman by the name of Sargent, thus the name Sergeant's Trench. It was dug out a little bit deeper and slightly modified to allow for fish passage around the falls, to get those anadromous fish to run up the river and around the falls themselves. But by the latter half of the 1700s, it had gone from what was essentially a early form of a fish passage to a water power canal system, to a raceway system that was powering mills, and for all intents and purposes had really become impassable to fish themselves. It was connected to the river through a series of these raceways known as the Great Flume. So if you look at this map here, you'll see the main chunk of the Blackstone running right to left across your screen. Off to the right of your screen, if you can see where the cursor is, you may see the Upper Dam or Slater Dam. And off of the river runs the Great Flume, which runs into the Swift Flume and then into Sergeant's Trench, which would go around the falls and bring the water back to the river. And it was along that Swift Flume that a decision would be made that would lead to legal consequences. Ozeel Wilkinson, a notable machinist and industrialist living in Pawtucket, set a lock on the gate mechanism on the Swift Flume, which regulated how much water would be let into the raceway. He set that gate at a level that was appropriate for him and his mills to power his mills, not really taking into account what the other business owners further down the canal required for their operations. In 1806, those other owners, again, a instance of sabotage, come out and they cut the lock off of that gate and they open it up to a level that is more appropriate for them. And this leads to a series of court cases which really culminated with a court case known as Tyler versus Wilkinson. In Tyler versus Wilkinson, and this map that you see on your screen is a map that is created for this court case to help the judge better understand the situation and who all of the owners were in all of these mill buildings along both the river and Sergeant's Trench and how the decision would affect each one of those people. The judge who presides over this case is U.S. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, and he's going to offer his decision in 1827. And he concluded on a concept which is now known as reasonable use. Basically, and this is a very simplistic explanation of this, but reasonable use basically says that water rights belong to the people who own the land immediately adjacent or next to the water itself. And every owner has a right to reasonable use of that water as long as it does not infringe upon another owner's use of the river or use of that water. That sounds pretty simple. But what it leads to is a very complex formula that is going to be developed by the court, where they literally break down how much water each owner needs in order to power their mill. So something that seems so simple becomes very complex in practice. But in many ways, this law can almost leave more ambiguity than it gave clear clarity. But this decision forms as a basis for water rights court cases still to this day in the United States of America. But that court case, Tyler versus Wilkinson, did not end the debate. The very concept of who owns water, or even if anyone has a right to own something as vital of a resource as water, is still debated in our time. And perhaps that conversation becomes even more urgent in our own times as viable drinking water becomes tougher to find in certain parts of our globe. But nonetheless, water provided the power that built the Industrial Revolution and also provided life in the Blackstone River Valley. And water is also one of the single most important resources that gives life to one of the most unique ecosystems on Earth, the Everglades. So now I want to introduce to you all uh, lead park ranger Rebecca Schroeder. Uh, Rebecca works at the 10,000 Islands District in the Everglades National Park. And I am very happy and excited, A, that she said yes to this, and B, that she is now in this role. When I was on a detail or a temporary assignment at Big Cypress National Preserve, which for all intents and purposes is part of the Everglades ecosystem. It's all kind of one big ecosystem, different park units, but one big ecosystem. Um, I had the privilege of working with Rebecca, and now am so very excited that she has a permanent job at the Everglades. And we are very happy to have you here with us tonight, Rebecca.
Thanks. I am very excited to be here. All right. See if I can figure out. All right. So, yes, as mentioned, I am here in Everglades National Park. So, first thing I wanted to talk about real quick before we jump into talking a little bit more about the use of water in the park is where exactly is Everglades National Park? So Everglades National Park is located down in the very, very southern part of the state of Florida. And it takes up a pretty big chunk of the southern part of the state. We are 1.5 million acres in size, making us the third largest park in the lower 48. We become 10th if you include Alaska, so we generally tend to ignore Alaska. We're the third largest. It's pretty great. Um, So that's where the Everglades is. And the reason that's important to know is because the next question becomes, what is the Everglades? Now, as Mark mentioned, Everglades National Park is not all of the Everglades. The Everglades ecosystem is actually much larger than that. The Everglades ecosystem starts clear up by Orlando, and it is basically a giant, slow-moving river. It starts clear up in Orlando, moves down through the Kissimmee River to Lake Okeechobee in the middle of the state there, and then widens out from there into what is traditionally known as the River of Grass, which is what we usually picture in our minds when we think of the Everglades. So it's this absolutely massive ecosystem. And then there's where Everglades National Park is in relation to that. So much smaller than the Everglades itself. Now, I want to pause for just a second and ask a question to everyone who's here today. What is your favorite national park or public space? What is your favorite place to visit? I lost the chat. So if there's stuff happening in the chat, you might have to read it to me because I can't find it.
I said Gettysburg or Acadia.
Those are both good options.
Castillo de San Marcos and Mammoth Cave from
Ooh, those are both
Shannon.
good ones.
Acadia or Redwoods. Olympic. Any park in Appalachia. San Antonio Missions.
Ooh, it's a good one.
Not a national park, but Monument Valley.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I added public space. There's some good ones out there that are not national parks. Awesome.
Carlsbad, Great Smoky Mountains. So we got a good spread.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this question because I think it's honestly kind of a hard question. There's so many amazing places in our country. It's hard to pick a favorite. But generally, with this kind of question, you get a couple, pretty standard answers. You get a lot of, things like uh, Yosemite or Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Acadia, Arches, these places that have these big, dramatic, beautiful landscapes. Or you might get places like the Statue of Liberty or Blackstone River Valley that have these monuments or buildings or stories of some kind that they are built around. So compare that to the Everglades. Personally, I think the Everglades is amazing, but I will also admit, Florida is rather flat. And when you look at the Everglades, what you basically see is this really long expanse of wet grass. And it is not uncommon for us to have people come into our visitor centers here and say that they are feeling a little bit underwhelmed. And why is this a national park? Because it's not necessarily the first, it doesn't match the first images that always pop to our mind when we think of national parks. Well, the answer to that question, why is Everglades a national park, is actually a little bit special. So this particular picture might start out looking pretty like flat and basic, but the closer you look, the more you're going to see. And what you're going to see in there is life. The more you look, the more life is going to start to pop up. We have so many plants and animals in Everglades National Park. In total, there are over 2,000 species here. Including a bunch of more than 90 species of butterflies, 14 species of amphibians. We have reptiles, mammals, birds, fish, lichen. I love lichen. Vascular plants, and many, many more. I mean, I counted up all of these ones and then just completely gave up when it came to other insects and snails and things like that, because honestly, I got tired of counting things. Um, but what I'm leading up to with this is that Everglades National Park was the first national park set aside specifically for its biodiversity. It was set aside for the sheer amount of life that is inside of it. One of my favorite quotes is from President Harry Truman at the dedication ceremony for Everglades National Park in 1947. And he said, "Here are no lofty peaks seeking the sky, no mighty glaciers or rushing streams wearing away the uplifted land. Here is land, tranquil in its quiet beauty, serving not as the source of water, but as the last receiver of it. To its natural abundance, we owe the spectacular plant and animal life that distinguishes this place from all others in our country." So Everglades is a place of life. And the reason all of that life is able to be found here is because of water. Everglades is a pretty wet place. We get about 60 inches of rainfall on average. So not as wet as some of the most rainy places in our country, such as some of the places you find in Washington, but still a pretty decent amount of water that we get every year. And we get this, we get all of this rain in one very specific time of year. So we're all familiar with the four seasons, right? Spring, summer, winter, fall. Well, in the Everglades, we do not have those seasons. We instead have summer and less rainy summer. Oh, sorry. No, that's not what they're called. We have what we call the wet season and the dry season. So the wet season is basically during the summer. It happens in May to November, and we get, pretty warm temperatures, but the main thing that we notice is it gets very, very humid during this time, which can create a very high heat index. So the air temperature can be one thing, but if the humidity is really high, then it makes your body feel a whole different temperature that is usually quite a bit higher than the actual air temperature. It's not always fun. And we also get afternoon thunderstorms almost daily. We make the joke sometimes that you can almost set your watch by the afternoon thunderstorm. And the dry season happens from November to April, and you get much cooler temperatures, much lower humidity, and it almost never rains. So you have about 3/4 of that 60 inches happening during this one chunk of the year, and then almost none of it happening the rest of the year. And yeah, so you can kind of get a look at how drastic that difference is between the seasons. Now, these two seasons create a very diverse range of habitats in the Everglades. So I mentioned that it's pretty flat down here. Our grand total of elevation change in the park, we go from about 0 to 8 feet above sea level. So when 8 feet above sea level is your tallest mountain, then you know that something's different here. But within that 0 to 8 feet, those variations, those tiny little variations in elevation that you get cause massive differences in the vegetation that you will find. And the reason for that is, again, those seasons. So during the wet season, we get a lot of rain and it pretty much floods everything. Most of the Everglades ends up being underwater. Then during the dry season, that water slowly dries up, drains out into the Gulf of Mexico. And this process repeats over and over, year after year. And you can see by looking at this animation, the lower elevation locations are underwater for a large portion of the year, while the higher elevation locations are almost never underwater. So different plants and animals that like different amounts of water will live in different parts of the Everglades. So for example, our highest habitat is our hardwood hammock, and that's where you're going to find uh, like palm trees that don't really like to get wet, Florida panthers, cats not a big fan of getting their feet wet. And then you have all these different habitats getting lower and lower and lower. You end up in cypress habitats. Cypress trees love water. The deeper the water is, the taller the cypress tree grows. Alligators, obviously, big fans of water. And then you eventually end up down at the ocean, where we find our manatees and our seagrass. So in total, we have 9 different habitats in the Everglades. And if you've ever visited like the Rocky Mountains or places like that, you know that generally it takes thousands of feet of elevation change to see that drastic of a change in plants and animals. But here in the Everglades, it's happening with changes of just a couple inches in elevation. So that's one of the reasons that we are able to have this massive amount of biodiversity in the Everglades. The other thing that this brings about this biodiversity is that the Everglades is a mixture of both tropical and temperate species. So we are in general the southern point of a lot of temperate species range and the northern point of a lot of tropical species range. So for example, you will find a red maple tree sitting next to a tropical gumbo limbo tree. You can find a temperate cormorant sitting next to a tropical anhinga. We have belted kingfishers that migrate down from the north to the Everglades, and we have swallow-tailed kites that migrate up from South America to breed in the Everglades. And then, of course, everyone's favorite tropical and temperate pairing, the temperate American alligator and the tropical American crocodile. They are fun. So that's how the water in the Everglades has resulted in this massive collection of different plants and animals and other forms of life. But of course, we're talking about water here today. And as always, water has a story that goes with it. So here in the Everglades, in the late 1800s, there was a big movement to reclaim the Everglades. It was often viewed as a place that had no value. It was seen as this big giant swamp that was basically a waste of space. And so the idea was that people wanted to be able to reclaim it and turn it into profitable land. And one of the main ways that this was done was through dredging, building canals, and draining wetlands. So on this screen, I have pictures of a couple of the big dredges that going through and digging out these massive canals. And you can see down below the resulting, some of those canal systems going out through the Everglades. So you have all this water draining into the canals, which then dried out a lot of the land. And that was used for agriculture, for residential and commercial purposes. Real estate companies would advertise this land as some of the most fertile land in the world, which you can kind of see in this newspaper article right here. And over the course of about 100 years, they succeeded in draining about half of the original Everglades. So a large amount of this water was diverted into other locations. I love this quote from the governor of Florida, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. He said, "Drain that abominable pestilence-ridden swamp." And that was the stance that he ran for office on for his governorship from 1905 to 1909. They weren't big fans of it. Yeah, so. And then, of course, as you have all of this land opening up, you have people moving down here to live on it. And if you have people coming, you need roads for the people to come on. So these massive roads were built across the state. You have the Highway 41, which was completed in 1928, and then later you have Interstate 75. And these roads basically acted as massive dams. So what water was still moving through the Everglades after being drained out into those canals was now running into these roads. And I have pictures of a couple of the canals next to the roads because they would use dredges like this one, and they would basically scoop up dirt, pile it up, and build the road on top of that. Because if you just built the road at ground level, then it would be flooded for half the year. So you have these big roads built. And the result of all of these different changes to the flow of water through the Everglades is this. So the picture that I showed you earlier of that big slow moving river, that is what the Everglades looked like historically. And compare that to the water flow through the Everglades today. Today, a lot of water is diverted off to the coast one way or another, and very little of it actually makes it down to the Everglades ecosystem itself. And obviously, that large of a change is going to have an effect on the environment. So in this case, one of the big things that we started seeing is that the fresh water that was coming down through the Everglades River was actually pushing against salt water from the ocean. And so when that pressure of the fresh water was no longer there or no longer as strong, the salt water was able to come further inland. And so the salt ended up getting into the aquifers underneath South Florida and actually ruining some people's wells because you started having salt water getting into the drinking water system. And in addition to that, this change in the salinity around the edge of the coast where that fresh water and salt water normally met and pushed against each other really affected the fish populations and the other wildlife populations in the area. And Florida has a very large fishing economy, and a lot of the fish that are important commercially here spend a significant portion of their life or of their early life in the Everglades. We have these mangrove ecosystems, these saltwater tolerant trees that create these intricate mazes of roots that the little fish can hide in, and it provides a shelter and basically a nursery for them. And if you lose that nursery, then you lose your fish population, which makes commercial fishing a lot harder because you need fish for that. So we started seeing some pretty significant changes to the ecosystem. And because of that, we went, okay, something needs to change here. So the result was the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. This was something that was authorized by Congress in the year 2000. It is a massive restoration project consisting of many other smaller projects. It is a $10.5+ billion project estimated to take over 35 years. It's the largest hydrologic restoration project ever undertaken in the United States, potentially in the world. And basically the purpose of this project is to restore preserve, and protect the South Florida ecosystem, the Everglades, while providing for other water-related needs of the region. Because the water from the Everglades is important for the plants and the animals, but water down here is also important for people. The Everglades provides drinking water for over 9 million people. It provides water for agriculture. It has so many uses and so many different things that it needs to be used for. And so the challenge with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or SERP, because that's a lot of words, um, is trying to find that balance between making sure that there is enough water moving through the Everglades to help the plants and animals, as well as enough water to be used for by people for agriculture, for drinking, for recreation. And then also there's that meeting point in between where the water in the Everglades keeps the salt water back so that we have more drinking water for people and we have stronger fisheries for the fishing industry. So there's all these different factors, and the struggle is finding that balance. And this is not a unique situation to the Everglades. You know, Mark was talking earlier about um, the uses of water and water as a resource. This is something that is it's an issue that we're seeing all across the country. We had issues regarding water use, water conservation, water as a resource. This is something that we're seeing a lot right now. And it's interesting because our view of water has changed over time. You know, we have moved from seeing water as this almost throwaway, infinite, it will always be here item to seeing it as this very finite resource that has many different uses, and trying to figure out exactly what that looks like. Because ultimately, all of life revolves around water. For humans, the only reason that we are able to live in any of the places we live in is because of water. We can live in we can live in the Everglades, or we can live in a desert. And ultimately, the only reason we're able to do it is because of water in one way or another. And in kind of a similar sense to that, in addition to the way that we view water changing, the way that we view land and landscapes has also been changing over the years. And the Everglades is also a really great example of that. You know, a lot of our early national parks that we set aside because they had these beautiful superlative landscapes. And then we started moving more towards setting land aside for other reasons, such as biodiversity and protecting ecosystems. We moved from seeing land as either useless or useful to recognizing things like the importance of being able to heal and recharge in natural spaces, the importance of preserving stories and history. Um, and yeah, just this idea of needing to balance our resources and what they are used for, and trying to find sustainability for both people and places. And again, this is something we see all over the country, but the Everglades is a really good example of that process that we are in the middle of, which I personally find very exciting. It's one of the reasons that I really enjoy living and working here. So, um, so to finish off, I wanted to end with, because we had our quote in here from Mr. Broward about drain that abominable swamp. So I wanted to finish off by a quote from someone named Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She was an amazing lady who was instrumental in the creation and the protection of the Everglades and Everglades National Park. And her quote was, "There are no other Everglades in the world. They are, and they always have been, one of the unique regions of the earth, remote, never wholly known. Nothing anywhere else is like them. Their vast, glittering openness, wider than the enormous visible round of the horizon, the racing free saltness and sweetness of their massive winds under the dazzling blue heights of space. They are unique also in the simplicity, the diversity, the related harmony of the forms of life they enclose. The miracle of the light pours over the green and brown expanse of sawgrass and water, shining and slow moving below. The grass and water that is the meaning and the central fact of the Everglades of Florida. It is a river of grass." And I love the idea that that useless, abominable swamp of the uh, of Browards is now someplace that people come from all over the world to see. So that's pretty cool. And that is the end of my Everglades 101.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I am kind of nervous to follow up on that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas quote because that is an amazing quote and that was a beautiful picture, and that was a great presentation. So thank you for sharing all that information about the Everglades with us. I have to admit to, when I first showed up in the Everglades, this was 3 years ago now. Tough to think that it was already 3 years ago that I went on that detail there, but for a New Englander, right? In New England, everything feels so claustrophobic, if you will. A lot of trees, hills. You don't see very far or long distances. To get out into that landscape and to just literally look until the horizon and see grass is pretty amazing. Like I'm thinking like the Shark Valley part district of the park, like to just look across an infinite almost landscape of just grass. It's kind of humbling in many ways. And I'm totally with you. The more I learned about the Everglades, the more beauty I saw in it, the more I cared about it. So hearing you talk about that it made me kind of nostalgic. And I'm like, it is such a beautiful place that the biodiversity there is unbelievable, almost unparalleled, besides maybe like tropical rainforests or something. So pretty astounding. We are going to encourage folks if they have any questions for us to be typing those into the chat for our discussion here. We did get a first question right out of the gate. We will confront this, I guess, right up front. Um, the thing on top of many people's mind, the python, Burmese pythons in the Everglades. How devastating has their impact been? Maybe a little bit of a background of why there are these invasive species there and kind of what has their impact been and how are things looking?
Yeah, absolutely. So pythons are definitely an issue down here. As are invasive species in general. We have a lot of invasive species in South Florida. Um, the great thing about South Florida is we have nice weather all the time. The bad thing about South Florida is we have nice weather all the time, which means pretty much any plant or animal can live here, whether it's supposed to or not. In the case of the pythons, they arrived in the area by way of the pet trade. You had these pythons that were either escaped from their owners or potentially were released. You get a python when it's about this big and really cute, and then when it becomes 11 feet long and you're having to feed it whole rabbits, it's suddenly not quite as much fun. And so people would potentially release them out into the Everglades, and they did really, really well here. We have absolutely no idea how many there are because they are really, really hard to find. The thing that pythons are really good at is camouflage. I hear a lot of stories from some of our rangers here. We have a program where we were put radio trackers on some of the pythons and follow them around to try to learn more about what they're doing in the ecosystem. And I've heard multiple stories of people looking for a python, knowing they're right next to it and not being able to find it until it moves and they're literally standing next to it because that's how good at camouflage they are. So they are really hard to find. It's hard for us to know how many there are because of that, but it also means that they are a big problem for the animals because animals in the Everglades aren't really set up to deal with a predator like that, which is, again, one of the reasons why they're so successful. Um, Different studies that have been done have showed numbers between 90 to 95% of the small mammal population down here just being gone. It's gotten to the point where you'll be going around the Everglades, and if you see a squirrel or a rabbit or a raccoon, it's like really exciting because you just don't see them anymore. So they have definitely been a major issue down here, especially for the small mammal population. So, and there's, many different things, uh, many different programs and projects and research going on trying to look into that issue. But ultimately, the takeaway from it is if you have a pet that you don't want, don't release it outside. It
Mhm.
can cause problems.
And in the Blackstone River Valley, I'll one up that. And if you have plants that are not native to the area too, be careful with how you use those plants and how those plants may spread into the ecosystem. Because we too in the Blackstone, not so much with animals, although there are some invasive animals, but more so invasive plants that interrupt our ecosystem. And one of my favorite things I learned, we had a mosaics and science intern. He was tremendous this past summer, James Nagaoka. Shout out to James. I'm not a scientist, so do not quote my science here. Historian by trade, I talk about old dead people. I do not talk about nature very much. But he gave me a great analogy in that think of invasive species as very rowdy partygoers, right? They're not non-native species may show up in a place and they're not really going to interrupt, but an invasive species is going to interrupt the party and they're going to cause issues at the party and kind of interrupt that equilibrium which exists in the environment. So definitely something that we deal with too in the Blackstone River Valley, albeit I don't think as seriously as the Burmese python problem. But somebody else, while we're on the topic of invasive species, is asking about monitor lizards and whether or not they've showed up in the Everglades yet.
That's a good question. I have not heard anything about monitor lizards, but that does not mean that they're not here. Um, I know I hear a lot about iguanas, about tegus. So there are definitely invasive lizard species that are here and that are causing problems. I don't know about the monitor lizards off the top of my head, but that definitely does not mean that they are not here.
Cool. Another issue, not cool that they're there, not there, but thank you for that answer. Um, another issue that we face here in the Blackstone River Valley, which someone's asking about in regards to the Everglades, is the effect of climate change, especially more increased and intense storms that have developed. Just back in December, we had tremendous rain events, which saw really the highest levels of flooding that we've seen in the Blackstone River Valley for a decade. And a lot of these events that are considered 50-year, 100-year storms are happening now on a much more frequent basis and in many ways are endangering some of our historic and cultural resources that we work to protect, places like Slater Mill and Wilkinson Mill and the Slater Dam and other resources all across the valley. How have you seen in the Everglades, and have you seen any effect of increased intensity in storms affecting the park, loss of wildlife, damage to the park, any of that?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So we definitely do get affected by storms down here. Um, it's interesting because there's kind of this, it goes both ways to an extent, right? Like hurricanes are the big storm that we think about down here in the Everglades, and hurricanes themselves are um not a bad thing in the Everglades. They're not always a good thing either. They kind of sit net neutral. They harm some things, they help other things, but they're just part of nature down here. The plants, the animals, they've all, been in this habitat for ages, and so they have ways of dealing with it. It's the humans who tend to be not quite so good at it. It's kind of funny. I'm currently sitting in a temporary visitor center because our original visitor center was killed in a hurricane in 2017. So then they gave us a replacement, which was destroyed in another hurricane in 2022. So then they were going to put us in this one, but it was delayed because it was flooded during a hurricane last year. So humans tend to be not so great at it, but the animals are a lot better equipped to deal with it. But we are definitely so I want to state that aspect of it, that like hurricanes on their own are not bad. But we have definitely been seeing the effects of climate change down here. There's changes in the water temperature, and that's going to affect storm frequency and intensity. But one of the other big things with climate change that we see down here is sea level rise. I talked about that, like freshwater and saltwater pushing against each other, but as sea level gets higher and higher, it's able to push that freshwater farther and farther back. And so we see the saltwater coming further and further inland. And that, of course, completely changes the makeup of the plants and animals and the chemistry and everything that's going on. So that has definitely been something that we've been seeing for sure.
Great. Um, One of the things that I always found so interesting at the Everglades was, and you talked about this quite a bit about the ecosystems and how literally inches can make the difference in what survives and what doesn't. On the Blackstone River Valley from Worcester, Massachusetts, at the Blackstone River's headwaters, we started about 438 feet above where the river ends in Pawtucket. So there's about a 438-foot drop. Some people will say 440, some people will say 436. I cut the middle, 438. Don't write me angry letters later. But 438 feet drop in the river, right? And that drop being a key part of the story of industrialization, right? It's the weight of water that produces power. So that drop may not be a massive drop over 48 miles, but that drop is significant for our story. And so when you talk about inches and the difference in inches in the Everglades being significant in the story and what animals can survive there, I think that that is a kind of a really neat thing for us to think about, right? And that it doesn't have to take thousands of feet of elevation to really make a difference. It could literally take just inches to make a difference. One of my favorite animals that lives in one of those ecosystems in the hardwood hammocks is the Florida panther. And I know that they have a very interesting story. So could you share with us a little bit more about the Florida panther and kind of their journey and where they are now as a species?
Sure, yeah. So the Florida panther, generally when you think of of a panther, the first thing that pops into your head is a black panther. Florida panthers, they are not black. They are a beautiful golden brown color. Because they're a subspecies of mountain lion. So at one point, we had mountain lions all across the United States. And then we went through our period where we said deer are good, everything that eats deer are bad, and went and tried to, cut down on the population of large predators all across the country, and were very good at it, and pretty much eradicated the mountain lion in the eastern part of the United States, with the exception of this little population down here. So we've had this little population of mountain lions that we call Florida panthers because that name is cooler than mountain lion. And we've had this little population down here, kind of cut off from the rest of the population. And it's considered a very endangered species. So the population, was very, very low at one point. About 50, 60 years ago, we were looking at a population of maybe 20 total. And in response to that, so because at one point you had mountain lions in kind of this continuous range, you had all these different recognized subspecies across the country that would interact with and interbreed with each other. So for the Florida subspecies, it would interact with the Texas subspecies and with a subspecies to the north of us. And so when the Florida panther population got so low, um, in an attempt to recreate some of that natural gene flow that at one point would have been occurring, some Texas mountain lions were brought to Florida, released, allowed to breed with the Florida panthers for a while, and then removed from the ecosystem. And it helped a lot. Our population, little unclear as to where exactly it's at right now, but most estimates put it at around 200, which from 20 to 200 is a pretty great change. So we are excited to see that.
Great. That's very good news, right? In many ways. Still a long way to go, but
Mhm.
positive news, definitely. My last question, and then there'll be more time if folks want to hang around after the formal presentation ends. But I asked this of everyone, what are any insider tips or tricks that you can share with us about visiting your park, best seasons to visit in, things to see and do while you're there? What insider tips and tricks can you give us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the Everglades is always beautiful and there's always cool stuff to do. But my favorite time to be here is definitely during the dry season, especially as we get towards the end of the dry season in like February, March, April, because as that water level drops down, all of the fish that live throughout the park, they get pressed into these smaller and smaller areas of water. And because the fish are all concentrated in one area, everything that eats the fish comes and hangs out in those areas. So the end of the dry season is the absolute best time to see large amounts of wildlife all in one area, which is really fun. We also get a lot of migratory like birds around that time. So yeah, our wildlife population is just amazing during the dry season. And then on top of that, it's a little bit cooler, not quite as humid. So it can be little bit more comfortable. And you don't have to make sure that you have all of your activities done by 2 p.m. if you don't want to be in a thunderstorm.
Having lived in South Florida in the dry season and visited in the wet season, I totally and wholeheartedly agree. Much better in the dry season in the winter months. Definitely. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great presentation. And just in conclusion for folks, the battle for water in many ways continues. Not only do we debate still who owns water, or does any one person have the right to own a resource as vital as water, but also who has the responsibility to protect it. In 1972, here in the Blackstone River Valley, a grassroots movement known as Zap the Blackstone set out to clean up the water of the river, literally removing trash from the river. This, with legislation like the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act, did much to remake our ecosystem in the Blackstone River Valley, but still a lot of work needs to be done. In regards to the Everglades, legislation like SERP hopes to address those former wrongs of the ecosystem, which Rebecca talked about. But I'm always drawn to this quote, if you'll all indulge me for a moment, from one of my favorite books about the Everglades. It's called The Swamp. It's by Michael Grunwald. And Michael wrote this in his conclusion, quote, "Today, America's air and water are much cleaner. Its rivers no longer catch fire. Its bald eagles are no longer endangered. But suburban sprawl and invasive species still pose a serious threat to nature in America, and global warming is a 20th century style pollution problem that the country cannot ignore for much longer. But reviving entire ecosystems is a challenge of the future. It will require Americans to think on a landscape scale, to clean up their own messes, to change its culture as well as its rhetoric, to surrender some of the historic battlefield to Mother Nature. On a landscape scale, restoring the Everglades is more than just a test of our ability to help ourselves. There is only one Everglades, and we have just about destroyed it. It is our responsibility to recognize this and to make amends, and that sets us apart from other species on Earth. End quote. A simple molecule, two hydrogen atoms, one oxygen atom, but how critical that one molecule is to the survival not only of the Everglades National Park and Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park, but to our species as a whole.